Today we're going to start in Matthew 14, and we're going to read the entire chapter. So go ahead and turn while I find it as well. I'm going to turn this way so I can read it. We all there? Okay, looks like we're almost all there. Okay. All right. At that time, 14, verse 1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her requests be granted, and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and looked and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot. When Jesus had landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks. And he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They ate, all of them, and they were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, not counting women and children. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side of the lake. While he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come out on the water. Come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him, and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. The word of the Lord. This day in Matthew 14 was by far the most productive day in Jesus' 3 years of ministry. He healed thousands, and then he fed thousands from nothing, and then he went and walked on water and had this beautiful moment with Peter, and then once they had gotten to the next town across the lake, he went right into healing all the sick from the entire surrounding country. Clearly, Jesus seems to be processing his grief in a different way than most humans do. I think this is exactly why we tend to separate the different sections of this chapter in our heads instead of thinking about it as one whole continuous narrative. Like, I've heard sermons about Jesus walking on water, and I've heard sermons about Jesus feeding the 5,000, and I've had sermons about John the Baptist getting his head cut off and what that meant to Jesus. But I've never heard all of it come together in one chapter. And I remember the first time I read Matthew 14, I was like, whoa, this is all in one day. Like, it's crazy to me. But throughout this whole day, it's important to recognize that everything Jesus does here is done while he was freshly grieving somebody that he loved probably more than most other people, if not anyone else. John the Baptist was his cousin. He was the only person in his family who really stood up for Jesus, besides his mother and his father probably. But like Jesus' own siblings didn't believe in him. John was the only person who was really hyped about Jesus, who was really excited about him being the Messiah, and who really truly believed in him since the womb. Like, even when they were in the womb, John leapt and kicked and all this stuff, like when he was near Jesus in Mary's belly. Like, so they were close, and Jesus just lost this man. It's important because it shows us the way that we should process grief and how our pain can be turned into power. The process of grief is difficult to live out well. There's so many intense emotions involved with grief that can distract and disorient our minds and hearts. Pete, in the book, lists several common self-defense techniques that we employ when we experience grief. I'm going to define them, and then we're going to go back and we're going to see sort of what did Jesus do instead. So the first one, denial, or selective forgetting, refusing to acknowledge some painful aspect of reality, whether it's external or internal, just kind of brushing it off. Next, we have minimizing, which is admitting something is wrong, but making it seem less impactful than it actually is, and not taking in the whole picture. And we have blaming others and God. We deny the responsibility for our behavior, and we project it out there upon somebody else. We also blame ourselves. We inwardly take the fault. Like you say, if I had been there, or if I had just done this, or if I could have just stopped them from whatever, there's so many different things that happen in that category of just blaming yourself. Then we have rationalizing. We offer excuses and justifications and alibis to provide an inaccurate, that's the key word, inaccurate explanation of what's going on. So, for example, Jesus could have said, John was a good man, but he shouldn't have said that thing to King Herod about his second wife. It's no wonder he ended up getting killed. So it's like trying to justify and trying to rationalize why the bad thing happened instead of just accepting that it did. And sometimes it doesn't have to have a reason. Intellectualizing. We give analysis, theories, and generalities to avoid personal awareness and difficult feelings. Next, distracting. We change the subject or engage in humor to avoid threatening topics. That's what I do most often. That's how I grieve. his humor. And then finally, becoming hostile. We get angry or irritable when a reference is made to certain subjects. So what did Jesus do instead? Instead of denial, Jesus went to be alone straight away. Instead of denying and refusing to acknowledge this painful thing that happened to him, Jesus went alone to pray. Actually, he didn't even really get to be alone, because it says once he got to the shore, there was already a crowd there. But he made no excuses, and he didn't try to minimize the impact of the event. At least his disciples, if not everyone, could see in that moment that the news had a great impact on Jesus, because they tried to later to dismiss the crowd, and then when Jesus told them to go back into the boat and go across the sea after they'd fed the 5,000, they didn't hesitate. They were just like, okay. And then Jesus went off alone to pray. So that they could eat. Okay. So Jesus also didn't minimize. Jesus never speaks about the death of John the Baptist, or at least in this chapter, but in his actions on this day, he shows the significance of John's death to him. John spent his adult life eating locusts and wearing sackcloth and being homeless, baptizing people in the River Jordan, and preaching about the imminent Messiah. He healed thousands and pointed thousands to Jesus. In response to his martyrdom, Jesus heals thousands of people, feeds potentially up to, if not greater than, 15,000 people with a kid's sack lunch. Then he walks on water, and then he goes and heals the rest of the countryside the next morning. Jesus was showing the truth in his statement from John 12:24, when he said, "Very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." Jesus seems to have immediately accepted the fact that John needed to die, and that he was going to anyway. But the death of John bore all this fruit in one day. It was the day that it happened. The day that Jesus found out, it already bore this amazing fruit and sparked this amazing revival in 2 different towns all around the Sea of Galilee. Next, instead of blaming others and God, what did Jesus do instead? He didn't blame anybody. He had the emotional bandwidth to recognize that the external situation, while extremely painful, does not have to affect his reactions or his subsequent behaviors in any way that he doesn't desire. He allows himself to be fully spirit-controlled, and he chooses to lean toward our pain, or to lean in and approach his pain head-on. Scazzero says, turning towards our pain is counterintuitive. But in fact, the heart of Christianity is that the way to life is through death, the pathway to resurrection through crucifixion. Of course, it preaches easier than it lives. Instead of blaming himself, Jesus didn't feel personal shame for John's death. He didn't try to put any extra weight on himself. He simply faced the situation for what it was. And he chose to accept that he was not supposed to be the one to save John from the sword. He resisted the temptation to take the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, and instead he released the feelings to God and stayed focused on what was in front of him. Instead of rationalizing, Jesus, he could have said something like, he ended up getting killed because he was slandering Herod's second wife. He shouldn't have done that, right? Or something like that. But, or something like that, where he would explain away John's death so that he could feel better about the situation intellectually, without actually allowing himself to feel and respond to the emotions that came with it. Instead, Jesus doesn't rationalize or justify what happened. He simply takes it as it is, and he chooses to honor John's life by giving life to others. Instead of intellectualizing, Jesus, I guess he didn't say, my situation is not that bad compared to other people. Like Marvin was saying earlier, that's a dangerous game to play. It's saying, oh, well, my pain isn't as big as somebody else, or I just lost my cousin, my friend just lost his wife, or lost his whatever, like both of his kids, I don't know. Like, what do I have to cry about? Jesus didn't do that. He didn't try to suppress his grief in order to stay active in his life. Instead, Jesus felt all of it, and he allowed the pain to flow from him, and he allowed it to turn into living water for thousands of people present that day. Instead of distracting himself, what did Jesus do instead? Although Jesus doesn't talk about John in this passage, we can tell that Jesus is not trying to gloss over the reality of the situation. This is clear when he tells the disciples to go on the boat without him, and then they just go, because he needed to go off and pray and be alone. He didn't want to burden others with his grief, but he also didn't want to distract or make light of what just happened. So he decided the best thing for him to do would be to wait until he can process alone with the Father first, before he speaks a word to anyone about John. And finally, instead of becoming hostile, getting angry and irritable when references were made to John, what did Jesus do instead? It's common for us to act defeated and feel frustrated when things happen outside of our control, especially death. But Jesus didn't snap or express any kind of anger or frustration after John's death, and he definitely didn't stomp his foot in defeat. Instead, we see him doing the opposite. John's death invigorated Jesus. It gave Jesus more to do, and it incited massive signs and wonders, and a revival spread around the Sea of Galilee in the first day of Jesus' grieving, when it was freshest, I guess. Jesus didn't try to medicate or cope. He withdrew to be alone with the Father first. Jesus did not become self-absorbed and inward-focused. He paid attention to what the will of the Father was through his pain. Jesus didn't turn the crowds away. He had compassion on them and healed their sick. Jesus didn't dismiss the crowds early. He gave thanks, and he multiplied the loaves and the fishes. Jesus didn't push himself too hard. He still gave himself time to go back and be alone with the Father all night in order to recharge after the full day of miracles. Jesus was not weakened or debilitated by his grief. He was strengthened by it somehow, because he trusted that God was everything that he needed, even though he had just lost something very important to him. Jesus didn't stray from his path. He allowed himself to be weak in his solitude so that the Lord could strengthen him and work through him when others still needed him. Pete Scazzero then goes on to discuss the 5 ways to healthily process grief when it strikes in our lives. So let's see how Jesus enacted them in Matthew 14. The first thing that Pete says, the first of the 5 ways to healthily process grief is to pay attention. Pete recalls a movie about a family who lost their oldest son and couldn't reconcile with their grief enough to stay together. Eventually, the parents in the movie lost their connection with their youngest son, and the mom and dad ended up divorcing at the end of the movie because they chose to throw up defenses in the face of grief, rather than paying attention to both God and themselves, what was going on. choosing to enter the confusion of their personal dark night of the soul rather than to medicate themselves is what we should have done. Yes, that's what they should have done, is to choose to enter into it and allow it to come and do the work. Allow grief to do the work in you so that you can have it out of your body, because it stays in your body if you don't let it. So Jesus never lost focus on God after losing his cousin. He paid attention to what was going on inside of himself, and he decided to go be alone to process it all. When he couldn't find solitude on the shore, he paid attention to God and his purposes for that moment. He chose to lean on God and to hold him up as he served, or to lean on God to hold him up as he served the crowds. So that is paying attention. Listening to what God is saying in your grief, even when it's fresh, especially when it's fresh. Because when it's fresh, we have a place of emptiness that is created within us. There's something that's been removed from our lives. So now there's a vacuum. And like I said, one of the other times I preached, when there's a spiritual vacuum, the Holy Spirit doesn't like stuff like that. God doesn't like emptiness. That's why there's all this, So the fact that there would be emptiness means that God rushes in, or something rushes in. So when we ask the Lord, and when we're paying attention to the Lord after loss, what rushes in is the Holy Spirit. What comes in to fill the gap is the Holy Spirit when we are paying attention. Does that make sense? Okay. Number 2, waiting in the confusing in between. It says, "Be still for the Lord and wait patiently for him." Psalm 37, verse 7. This remains one of the most radical commands of our day. It requires enormous humility. Scazzero says, "Do you know what it is like to feel worse after talking with some people who are trying to make you feel better?" The confusing in between resists all earthly categories and quick solutions. It runs contrary to Western culture that provides our spirituality. It is for this reason that we have such an aversion to the limits of God that he places around us. Or not the limits of God, but the limits which God places around us. Jesus has no such aversion. Surely, during this day in Matthew 14, there was a whirlwind of thoughts that must have been running through Jesus' mind. What is to happen to me now that they got John? What am I going to do now without my biggest advocate? Is there going to be more innocent blood that will be spilled for me? Jesus didn't give in to any of these thoughts, though. Instead, he decided to sit in the uncomfortable and ever confusing in between, where life continued moving while he chose to be still and be silent and to wait on the Lord. Number 3, embrace the gift of limits. I like the wording of that. Embrace the gift of limits. So we don't think of our limits usually as a gift. And we definitely don't embrace our limits. We don't love our limits. We usually try to limit our limits as much as possible. Humans have a myriad of limitations. Our physical bodies, our families of origin, our marital status, our intellectual capacity, our talents, our gifts, our marital or material wealth, our personalities, our time, our work and relationship realities, and our spiritual understanding are all limits that we deal with on a daily basis. So how does embracing our limits help us with processing grief? Well, John the Baptist actually models wonderfully for us what it means to embrace our limits. Crowds that formerly followed John for baptism switched their allegiances once Jesus began his ministry, right? So they began leaving John to follow Jesus. Some of John's followers were upset about this traumatic turn of events, and they complained to him, wow, everyone's going to him. And John understood his own limits, and he replied, a person can receive only what is given them from heaven. So essentially he was able to say, I accept my limits, my humanity, my declining popularity. He must increase and I must decrease. Jesus similarly models an acceptance of his limits when he confronts the problem of the thousands of hungry people. He just lost John, and he will not be resurrecting him anytime soon. So for now, Jesus has no way to immediately resolve the situation. But he accepts it, and he chooses to outlet his loss in a healthy way by accepting that there is not enough food and that there was no doctor around to heal the multitude. And Jesus decided to go to God and simply give him thanks in that moment. And then he was able to feed the crowd as a result of God's unlimited power and strength. Number 4, we climb the ladder of humility, which I need to read from this book. It's brief. There's a lot on the ladder of humility in this chapter, but I'm just going to read off the different steps. So step 1 of the ladder of humility, essentially the ladder of humility is like sort of the steps that we take in order to understand sort of where does my identity lie when I'm experiencing grief. Like, how can I live into my identity and deny the false identities that start to kind of creep in when we experience grief. Like, for example, if you're grieving a breakup, then you will start to have these other false identities start being placed on you by the enemy, who's saying like, oh, you just weren't good enough, or oh, you should have tried harder, or oh, maybe if you were more, I don't know, whatever, attractive or nice or something like that, easy to get along with or whatever. All those little identifiers just start to get into your head. And so the ladder of humility prevents that, but then it also prevents the pride part and blaming God on the other side of things and blaming others. And so, it just helps us to remain in our identities in the middle. So, step 1, fear of God and mindfulness of Him. So we often forget the presence of God as if God weren't present. Step 2, doing God's will and not our own or other people's. Step 3, willing to subject ourselves to the direction of others. Step 4, be patient to accept the difficulty of others. Step 5, radical honesty to others about our weaknesses and faults. Step 6, become deeply aware of being chief of all sinners. Step 7, be purposeful to speak less or with more restraint. And then 8, transformed into the love of God. So at the end, there is no haughtiness, there's no sarcasm, there's no put downs, no airs of importance. We're able to embrace our limits and those of others. We are fully aware of how fragile we are and are under no illusions. We are at home with ourselves and content to rely on the mercy of God. And everything is a gift. So that's what the ladder of humility, when we climb it, it can help us climb out of grief. And then number 5, we let the old birth the new in God's time. And that is more the result, but it is the final step as well. Because if we don't allow that final step, then there's no result, I guess. There's no outcome, and there's no people getting fed. There's no Jesus walking on water. Like, if he didn't act after that, if he didn't let the old give birth to the new, then he wouldn't have had the results that we see. But yeah, so before reading this book, I assumed that the commonly known 5 stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, were inevitable for every single person to go through every time they experience grief. I thought it was just the process that you go through. You start with denial, and then you go to anger, then depression, then whatever. Then bargaining, depression, acceptance. But I don't know. Now I'm kind of having second thoughts. I also assumed that grief could never lead to something good. But now I'm also having second thoughts about that. After reading this book and going through this chapter, and going through Matthew 14, I don't know. Jesus went straight to acceptance without blinking. I know it's cheesy to be impressed by God sometimes, but I was just genuinely blown away when I realized what he had done. I just have never seen, I always knew that Jesus was perfectly emotionally healthy. I always just assumed and cognitively understood that, but I never really thought about what that would even look like. I never thought about what it practically looks like, that Jesus is the most emotionally healthy person that's ever existed. But I believe that the picture from Matthew 14 is a wonderful illustration of Jesus' incredible ability to accept grief, not running away from it, not turning away from it, not ignoring it, not minimizing it, not hyperbolizing it, not rationalizing or intellectualizing or any of the other isings. He faced loss head on. He let it in. He recognized what he needed, and he surrendered to the will of the Father. He chose to heal and give thanks. He chose to feed and to nourish. He chose to reveal himself to his friends. He chose to have compassion. He chose to be humble and embrace his limitations. Now, Jesus is the most impressive example I've ever found of how to deal with grief. But for me, it still feels unattainable because I'm not also God fully. I'm just fully human, So I've never seen a human who isn't also God move so smoothly through the loss of a loved one. I was joking last night with Lauren that if something like this happened with her, you would definitely not find me healing thousands of people the same day. You would definitely not find me walking on water, and I would definitely not get into another boat to go across the lake to heal all of the sick people in the subsequent countryside. I would not do those things. I would be alone. I would not be okay. Or if it was anybody, my sisters, if something like that happened where somebody I love just was beheaded in prison, I wouldn't be okay. I don't know. So I don't know. It feels unattainable to me. I tried to find it in the disciples or someone in the New Testament. After seeing all of it happen to Jesus and understanding that the Holy Spirit lived in him as the Holy Spirit lived in me, I'm starting to believe that it is still possible to go through grief in a way where we can rapidly approach acceptance instead of having to go through all of the other mess that it goes through, that happens. And so I tried to find an example of somebody who did this in the New Testament after Jesus with the Holy Spirit present, who's a human being. And I did. It is possible because of the Holy Spirit. And there's one person who really said it best. So let's turn to Philippians 1:12. We're going to read from Paul really fast. And we'll land the plane here. Philippians 1:12. Yeah, here we go. So Philippians 1:12, we're going to read through verse 21. He says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." I didn't realize that this chapter was Paul processing grief. Or basically the whole book of Philippians is Paul giving his theological dissertation on grief, like on how suffering can be seen through the lens of the resurrection and through the lens of the crucifixion and through the lens of the Holy Spirit. Paul was in prison in this moment, and he had just gotten beat like very close to death the day before. I'm pretty sure this was while he was that part, but I might be wrong about that. But nonetheless, Paul has been beaten several times at this point. Paul has been thrown out of cities and thrown out of towns and synagogues. Paul has been chased by mobs. Paul has been suffering, essentially, for the sake of Christ, and been put through grief for the sake of Christ. But with the power of the Holy Spirit, he was able to harness some of what Jesus modeled. He was able to not only process his pain, but come on the other side of it and to start to see it from another perspective. He was able to process his situation and to see it from a new perspective instead of, oh, I'm in prison, oh, I shouldn't have said that, oh, I don't know, like I'm scared, what are they going to do, like, are they going to hurt me, are they going to kill me? He wasn't even thinking about any of that. He was just like, the gospel's being preached. And now the whole palace guard knows that I'm here because of Jesus. And now they want to know who Jesus is. And now we have people who are also in prison who are grieving. And they also are getting encouraged. because we have hope. And because I know Paul, know who I am, and because I know who Jesus is, and because I know the end of the story. I know the end goal, and I've seen what is to come. So everything that's happening in this present moment, I can just lean on God and ask Him, what do you want me to do here? You know, this is painful, yes, and I'm suffering, yes, and it's dark, yes. Roman prisons were not fun places to be, unless you were a citizen, which Paul was, but like he was actually thrown into prison this time, which is basically a hole carved out of the ground, and then people just kind of throw you in this little pit, and then a bunch of people sit around in this pit in the pitch dark, and there's nothing there, and there's like you're bumping into people, there's human pee and feces all over the place because there's just nowhere to go to the bathroom or anything, and it's dark for almost 24 hours of the day. And then for a little bit of the day, you were allowed to leave the prison or leave that dark cell with all the other people and then go work outside, and sometimes they had quarries and stuff like that, or like you would just do some manual labor and then you'd come back. That was Roman prisons for the most part, for non-citizens or the worst criminals. And this is where Paul is writing things like, yes, and I will rejoice even more. The miracles that came from prisons, like just the whole thing with the earthquakes when Paul was in prison and they were worshiping, and then the earthquake happened and the walls fell down, and he was just like, oh, I guess we're free. But then they didn't leave, and because they still had work to do, because they were still paying attention to what God was saying. So I guess what I'm trying to say, hopefully now we all at least have some helpful tools for us to utilize when we go through grief. It is possible for us to move rapidly towards acceptance, and when we do that, when we do move towards acceptance and choose to pay attention to God, when we choose to wait in the confusing in-between, when we choose to embrace the gift of limits, when we choose to climb the ladder of humility, and when we choose to let the old birth the new in God's timing, when we choose to do these things, it will result in amazing, miraculous things. Because that's just, I don't know, I just have a feeling that is sort of almost a recipe for God to come in and do something. Because again, it's just involving that emptiness. And when we say I don't have the tools to deal with this grief, God, please help me, that's this opportunity for God to come in and to step in. And so then we can partner with God and pay attention to what He's doing in the moment, when our grief is freshest even. So yeah, it will take some work and a lot of prayer and a deep, deep intimacy with Jesus to process grief in this way. But if we can even find a way to mitigate some of the more harmful effects of grief that can come about, I think we'll do well for ourselves. And that's my hope for us. It takes knowing yourself and knowing who God says you are, and being in tune with the guidance, the comfort, the compassion, and the power of the Holy Spirit.